During St. John Maximovich's life, as I'm sure many of us know, he was a bishop, of course, but also a pastor at many different countries in the world. He's often called St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco because, especially in those days, there were lots of Russian immigrants in China, either from trade and jobs and so forth, kind of making their way to some of the port cities or some of the very metropolitan centers of China. There were Greeks there as well, by the way. Greeks tend to find their way to anywhere there when there's jobs and work to be had. He also, at one point, because of a lot of different circumstances, found himself taking care of a group of Russian Orthodox Christians in the Philippines at one point. And while he was in the Philippines, and eventually, by the way, he came to San Francisco and served the Russian church here. While he was in the Philippines, there was a building that was used for their worship, and they had children there, and there was a school there that they temporarily had, to have the children take classes in and so forth. And one day there was a man, a Russian Orthodox man, who was doing some work on the side of the building. I don't remember if he was touching up something with some paint or maybe washing a window or something, but he was on some very, very high scaffolding, or maybe one of those things, the pulleys that you pull up with rope and goes up and the person does their work. That man unfortunately had an accident and fell from very, very high up all the way to the pavement and crushed his skull. His skull, actually, doctors said, was in 12 pieces after this happened. And St. John, even though he was told that the circumstances were very dire, and the man only had a matter of, who knows, hours, maybe a couple of days, we don't know, but there's no way that he's recovering from this. St. John, in this circumstance, if I remember the details correctly, there's so many miracles and healings that St. John did, so I might be mistaking a couple of stories for all I know, but if I remember correctly from this book that we read, actually it was Man of God, maybe the most famous book of St. John, but it was during seminary when I wrote this paper, but I digress. St. John went with unction to this man's hospital bed every day and anointed him one day, and then anointed him a second day, and anointed him a third day, and a fourth day, and a fifth day. And by the time the week had gone on, maybe by the 10th day, maybe even beyond that, the skull had started reconstructing itself. And the pieces that this man's skull had been broken into started connecting themselves back together, until the point came when the man was perfectly whole again. Now, the moral of the story here is not just that I hear this story personally, and there are so many levels that we could talk about. We could talk about the power of the sacraments, for one, because unction is not simply any prayer service, of course. It is a sacrament of the church, and we will celebrate it on Holy Wednesday again this year. Last year we did not because nobody was in the church and nobody was allowed to take anything home, or this year we will have disposable Q-tips, but we'll get to that point in a couple of weeks, God willing. We could talk about the power of the sacraments. We could talk about how St. John had discernment and how he anticipated that this man is not hopeless. I won't just go and anoint him one day and then wait for him to pass. There was a sense about St. John. And he knew, as any good shepherd would on behalf of the chief shepherd, that this situation required a specific prescription. And so he went day after day after day, knowing that he would become well after anointing him many times. So we could talk about the sense that St. John had, the discernment that he had to be able to understand that this is what this particular situation required. And even he in his own life didn't encounter every situation like this. It's not to say that every single hospital that he visited, he did exactly the same thing. Far from it. He knew, case by case basis, what each person needed. My message to us tonight, as has been the case the last few Mondays in Lent, simply is that the prayers of saints are very powerful. And the good news is, for us as Orthodox Christians, we have these prayers at all times and at every hour. The saints are constantly praying for us, whether they are alive on this side of the kingdom or alive on the other side of the kingdom. And let us always remember that when it comes to specific needs that we might have in life, that we can pray to them for those as well. St. John is still a good shepherd on behalf of, again, the chief shepherd, the high priest, in whose priesthood we all share. St. John, as we know, is a great saint in our church and stands ready to help the faithful in the Bay Area at all times. Whether they're Orthodox or not, by the way, I've heard miracle stories in the cases of other lives as well, because he's just that kind of person. As are all the saints, by the way. They don't reject any prayers that come to them if someone asks them for help. So let us remember that we too can ask them for help. They already are helping us, of course, and God knows what we need, but we also might have some things on our hearts too. So let us not hesitate to ask them. Say, St. John, please, by your intercessions, my son might need this, or my job might have this, or this health concern, or my mother, or my father, or my church, whatever it might be, my friend, the world, and so on. From the multitude of transgressions that we have and weaknesses in the world, let us remember that they always are listening and quick to hear, a term we use for the Panagia, but all of the saints listen and hear in our specific needs and requests. May we have their intercessions and their prayers, both as we continue our journey to the Feast of Feasts, but also, of course, every day of our life. God bless you. And is it too early to say Kalia Anastasi? Probably, but I'll say it anyway. God bless you. Have a wonderful evening. Nastakala.